Welcome to a deep dive into one of the most captivating mysteries of all time, consciousness. You've clearly got a curious side, sending us all this material on such a complex topic. It's a topic that's puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries, and we're going to try and unpack it together. We're going to sift through these sources you've provided, extract the most fascinating insights, and see if we can walk away with a new understanding of this thing we call consciousness.
It's tall order, but what's fascinating here is how much our understanding has evolved even in recent decades.
Okay, so let's set the stage a bit. I was reading this source, and it mentioned how, for a long time, the science world treated consciousness research almost like, that weird relative at a family reunion that everyone tries to avoid?
Right. There's a good reason for that. It wasn't seen as a real science for a while. Too subjective, too intangible to pin down with scientific methods.
It's funny, this source actually quotes Francis Crick, the DNA pioneer. And even he thought studying consciousness was pointless. There was even this dictionary definition of consciousness from 1987. Consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomena. It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved.
Whoa.
Nothing worth reading has been written about it. Savage.
Yeah, does sound a bit harsh now, but that was the prevailing view back then. Consciousness was like this taboo subject, relegated to late-night dorm room debates rather than serious scientific inquiry.
But thankfully, science has a way of pushing boundaries. I mean, think about it just a few decades ago. Mapping the human genome seemed impossible. And now look at us.
Exactly. And just like cracking the genetic code revolutionized our understanding of life, exploring consciousness has the potential to unlock profound insights into what it means to be human.
So why should you care about consciousness? Because it's at the very core of your being. It's the feeling of the sun on your skin, the joy of listening to your favorite song, the ache of a broken heart, every single experience you've ever had filtered through this incredible thing we call consciousness.
And even though it feels so deeply personal and subjective, there are underlying mechanisms, biological processes happening in the brain that give rise to this inner world we all experience, and that's what makes this exploration so exciting.
Okay, so we've established that consciousness is a big deal, and we're not backing down from the challenge of understanding it. But where do we even begin? How do we start to unravel something so complex, so deeply woven into the fabric of who we are?
Well, sometimes the best way to tackle a complex problem is to start simple, to look for clues in unexpected places. So let's do something a little radical. Let's step away from the human brain for a moment and journey to the very roots of life itself.
Wait, are we talking single-celled organisms here? What could they possibly tell us about consciousness?
You might be surprised. You see, even the simplest life forms, those single-celled organisms, have this remarkable drive, a drive to survive, to maintain their internal balance. We call it homeostasis.
Right, like keeping their internal temperature and chemical soup just right. Basic survival stuff.
Exactly. But here's the kicker. This drive for homeostasis, even in something as seemingly simple as a single-celled organism, requires a basic form of awareness, a way of sensing and responding to the environment. They're not thinking complex thoughts, but they're demonstrating a kind of proto-consciousness.
Okay, so they're aware, but are they making choices? Are they actually deciding what's good or bad for them?
Let's consider chemotaxis. Single-celled organisms use this process to move towards things they need, like nutrients, and away from things that could harm them, all based on chemical signals. They're literally making decisions based on what they're sensing in their environment.
So even without a brain, they're exhibiting a kind of value-based behavior. They're choosing what they like and dislike, what helps them thrive. That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It challenges our assumptions about where consciousness begins, doesn't it? It suggests that even at the most fundamental level, life has this inherent drive to sense, respond, and even make choices based on what it perceives.
This is already making me rethink everything I thought I knew about consciousness.
Yeah.
But if even single-celled organisms can be aware, what happens as life gets more complex? What about those creatures with brains, but maybe not as intricate as ours?
That's where things get even more interesting. Let's zoom in on a part of the brain that often gets overlooked. The brainstem.
The brainstem. I have to admit, I always thought of it as a kind of biological relay station, just passing signals back and forth between the body and the thinking parts of the brain.
It does play a role in relaying information, but it's far more than a passive messenger. The brainstem is ancient in evolutionary terms, responsible for our most vital functions: breathing, heart rate, regulating sleep. But here's the really intriguing part. The brainstem may also hold the key to understanding the very roots of our feelings and even a primitive sense of self,
Hold on, feelings in the brainstem. How can we even know that?
Well, this is where the research you provided gets really fascinating. It talks about children born without a cortex, the outer layer of the brain we typically associate with higher level thinking and processing.
So these children are missing what we often consider the thinking part of the brain.
Exactly. And yet, despite lacking a cortex, these children still exhibit basic emotions. They react to pleasant and unpleasant stimuli. They experience joy and distress.
So even without the part of the brain we typically associate with consciousness, these children are still having subjective experiences. That completely challenges the whole mind-body split idea, doesn't it? It suggests that consciousness might be rooted in something much deeper, much more fundamental to our biology.
You're catching on quickly. This is where we start to see how deeply intertwined our physical sensations and our mental experiences truly are, a connection that might be much more profound than we previously realized.
This is blowing my mind. We've gone from single-celled organisms making choices to children without cortexes experiencing emotions. I can't wait to dive even deeper into these sources you've shared, but before we do, I need a moment to process all of this. Okay, so we've established that consciousness might be more deeply rooted in our biology than we previously thought. But what about emotions? I mean, we humans are feeling machines. Where do emotions fit into all of this?
Yeah, emotions, they're not just these fluffy add-ons to our rational minds, you know? They're deeply intertwined with our conscious experience, shaping how we perceive and interact with the world.
So how do they work? What's going on in our brains and bodies when we feel, say, joy or fear?
Well, one of the key insights from this research you've shared is the importance of the body in shaping our emotions and ultimately our conscious experience. This might surprise you, but our bodies aren't just along for the ride. They're active participants in shaping our inner world.
Wait, really? You're saying our bodies are just as important as our brains when it comes to emotions and consciousness?
Absolutely. You see, for centuries, we've been operating under this mind-body split, this idea that our mental and physical selves are totally separate. But the latest research, it's showing that's simply not true. Our physical sensations directly influence our mental states.
Okay, that's a pretty radical concept. Do you have an example, something that illustrates this mind-body connection when it comes to emotions?
Sure. Think about the feeling of butterflies in your stomach.
Yeah.
We often use that phrase to describe a feeling of nervousness or excitement.
Yeah, we all know that feeling.
Yeah.
But how's that an example of the mind and body working together?
Well, it's not just a figure of speech, right? It reflects this really intricate connection between our gut and our brain. Our gut actually has its own nervous system. It's often called the second brain. And guess what? It's in constant communication with our brain up in our heads.
Whoa, a second brain in our gut. That's wild. So when my stomach starts doing flips on a roller coaster, that's my gut brain talking to my head brain.
Exactly. And that communication goes both ways. Your thoughts and emotions can trigger physical sensations in your gut, and those sensations, well, they're relayed back to the brain, further influencing your emotional state. It's a two-way street.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does this all tie back to consciousness?
It's all about interoception, how our brains constantly monitor our internal state. We're talking heart rate, temperature, even muscle tension. Our brains are always paying attention to these subtle signals from our bodies.
So we're sensing our internal state, but how does that translate into a feeling like joy or fear?
Think of it this way. When you encounter something in the world, let's say you see a snake slithering towards you, your brain processes that information and it triggers this whole cascade of physical changes in your body. Your heart might start racing, your muscles tense up, you might even start to sweat.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Fight or flight kicking in.
Exactly. These physical sensations are then relayed back to the brain through that interoceptive pathway we were talking about. And it's this loop of body-brain communication, this constant feedback loop that gives rise to our conscious experience of emotion, in this case, fear.
So it's not just the snake itself that creates the fear. It's the whole symphony of bodily sensations that our brain interprets.
You got it. It's like our brain is asking our body, okay, what's going on here? How should we be feeling about this snake situation? And our body responds with a whole bunch of physical cues that our brain then uses to construct the feeling of fear.
And then we react accordingly, either by running away from the snake or, if you're feeling really brave, maybe trying to make friends with it. Okay, probably not the best idea. But this whole mind-body connection is making me rethink how I experience the world. What happens when we bring memory into the mix? How does memory fit into this intricate web of brain, body, and emotions?
Oh, memory is absolutely crucial for consciousness. Think about it. Without memories, we'd be stuck in this perpetual present, unable to form a sense of self, a personal history, or even like a plan for the future. One particularly important type of memory is what we call autobiographical memory, essentially the story of our lives. It's the collection of experiences, relationships, and events that make us who we are.
Right, those memories, those snapshots of our past, they shape how we see the world, how we relate to others, even the choices we make.
Precisely. But how are these memories actually formed and stored in the brain? How do we pull up a specific memory like that time you went hiking in the mountains and stumbled upon a breathtaking view? Well, one of the sources you provided dives into this fascinating concept of divergent zones, or CDZs, in the brain. Think of them as these bustling hubs of neural activity where different streams of information converge and then diverge, creating a cohesive experience.
Okay, so these CDZs are like the brain's grand central station, where all the sensory information from the world around us, sights, sounds, smells, all comes together.
Exactly. But it's more than just a gathering place. These CDZs are where the magic of memory formation happens. They're like master weavers, taking the threads of our sensory experiences and weaving them together into this rich tapestry of memory. Let's go back to your mountain hike example.
Okay, I'm imagining myself back on that trail. The sun is warm on my skin. I can smell the pine needles, hear the birds chirping, and see the sunlight filtering through the trees.
You've got it. All those individual sensory experiences, the sights, sounds, smells, even the feeling of the sun on your skin, those are all being processed in different parts of your brain. Your visual cortex is handling the sights, your auditory cortex is processing the sounds, and so on.
Right, our brains are like this incredible orchestra, with different sections playing different parts.
Exactly. But for you to experience that hike as a unified whole, to remember it as a single event, all those separate sensory streams need to be brought together, bound together in a meaningful way. And that's where the CDZs come in. They act like conductors, orchestrating the activity of these different brain regions, synchronizing their firing patterns so that they're all playing the same tune, so to speak.
So they're taking the sight of the sunlight through the trees, the sound of the birds, the smell of the pine needles, and they're weaving them together into a single coherent memory.
Precisely. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. Your brain doesn't just passively store those woven together memories, it actively reconstructs them every time you recall that hike.
Wait, what do you mean by reconstruct? I thought memories were like recordings in our brains, like playing back a video.
That's what we used to think. But it turns out it's much more dynamic than that. When you recall a memory, your brain isn't just hitting play on a pre-recorded video, it's more like it's pulling up a recipe and trying to recreate that dish. It reactivates those CDZs, those master weavers, and they draw on the stored sensory information from multiple areas of the brain to reconstruct the experience. It's a creative process, which is why our memories can sometimes be a bit fuzzy or even change over time.
Wow, so each time we remember something, we're essentially reliving that experience, but with a few creative tweaks here and there. That's incredible. But what about the emotional aspect of memories? I mean, when I think back to that hike, I don't just remember the sights and sounds. I remember the feeling of awe, the sense of peace. How does that work?
That's where the emotional centers of our brain, like the amygdala, come into play. When we experience something that triggers a strong emotional response, whether it's joy, fear, or sadness, the amygdala attaches an emotional tag to that memory. So when you recall that hike, the CDZs are not only reactivating the sensory aspects of the experience, but they're also tapping into those emotional tags, bringing back the feeling of awe you experienced.
So our memories are these incredible tapestries woven from our senses, our emotions, and even our thoughts and interpretations of the event. It's like our brain is constantly curating our life experiences, creating a unique narrative that shapes our understanding of the world and ourselves. But our memories are so malleable, so open to interpretation and even distortion. What does that mean for our sense of self? Is there even a stable self if our memories are constantly being rewritten?
That's a profound question, and one that philosophers and scientists have grappled with for centuries. It gets at the very heart of what we mean by consciousness, by the self.
So we've been on this incredible journey through the inner workings of consciousness, from the surprising awareness of single-celled organisms to the complex interplay of our brains, bodies, and emotions. And you're right, this whole idea of memory being a reconstruction, a constantly evolving narrative, it really makes you question what we even mean by a self, doesn't it? If our memories are so fluid, is there even a core, unchanging me in there?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer, but the research you shared offers some intriguing clues. One of the key concepts is this idea of the autobiographical self.
The autobiographical self, what is that exactly?
Yeah. Think of it this way. You've got all these individual memories, these little snippets of experience scattered throughout your brain. The autobiographical self is like the master storyteller. It's the editor who takes those fragments and weaves them together into a cohesive narrative, the story of you. It's the part of us that remembers our first bike ride, the awkwardness of that school dance, the joy of landing our dream job.
So it's like our own personal highlight reel.
Yeah.
The memories that we use to define who we are.
Exactly. But it's more than just a collection of greatest hits. The autobiographical self is constantly shaping and revising our life story, making sense of our experiences, and creating a sense of continuity over time. It helps us answer that question, who am I, based on where we've been and what we've experienced.
Okay, that makes sense. But if our memories are so malleable, so prone to distortions and reinterpretations, doesn't that mean our sense of self is also constantly shifting?
To some extent, yes. And this is where things get really interesting. You see, our sense of self isn't this fixed or static thing. It's dynamic, always evolving. As we encounter new experiences, form new relationships, learn new things, our autobiographical self updates and revises our life story accordingly.
So we're not just telling ourselves the same story over and over. We're constantly rewriting and reinterpreting our past in light of our present experiences.
Precisely. And that's actually a good thing. This flexibility, this ability to integrate new information and adapt our self-narrative, that's what allows us to grow and change over time. It's what makes us resilient in the face of challenges.
That's a really empowering way to think about it. Our sense of self is a work in progress, always open to revision. But this brings up another big question that's been swirling around in my head. We've been talking about all these different aspects of consciousness, awareness, emotions, memories, the self. But what about the subjective experience of it all? The redness of red, the taste of chocolate, the feeling of love, what it's like to be conscious that feels like the biggest mystery of all.
You've just hit upon what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. How do we explain why we have these subjective experiences, these qualia, at all?
Right. It's one thing to talk about neurons firing and brain regions lighting up, but how do we explain why those physical processes give rise to the feeling of experiencing something? Why does red look like something to us?
That's the million-dollar question, and honestly, science is still grappling with it. We can trace the neural pathways involved in processing color information. We can pinpoint the areas of the brain that light up when you experience the color red, but explaining why that neural activity translates into the subjective experience of redness, that's where things get fuzzy.
It's almost like that's the point where science bumps up against the limits of its own methods, right? Like, how do you measure the subjective feeling of redness in a lab?
Exactly. And that's what makes consciousness such a tantalizing mystery. It pushes us to the very edge of what we can explore and understand about ourselves and the universe.
Well, we may not have all the answers yet, but this deep dive has been mind-blowing. We've covered so much ground, from the building blocks of awareness to the mystery of subjective experience. If you're listening to this, your brain is probably working overtime right now trying to process it all.
And that's the beauty of it. Exploring consciousness isn't just about finding answers. It's about asking those bigger, bolder questions and embracing the mystery of it all.
Absolutely. And who knows what breakthroughs await us as we continue to explore this inner universe. Maybe one day we'll crack the code of consciousness, unlock the secrets of subjective experience. But until then, the journey continues.
And what a journey it is.
That's right. So keep those brains buzzing, keep asking those big questions, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.